Welcome back to this week's sermon, my fellow irradiated ones. This is a continuation of my Cartography series, where we look at Fallout 4 from a whole new perspective. My good and pious friend, the Cartographer, has been putting in the legwork to map out the most mysterious faction in the Commonwealth, the shadowy Institute. He infiltrated their ranks, blended in, and gathered all this data to see what new things we could learn about the boogeymen of the Commonwealth. So crank up the rads and warm up your molecular relay while we look at the maps of the Institute. Now, the first thing I always like to do in these map videos is show the distribution of the group or faction as of the beginning of the game. The Institute is a little tricky because they operate in the shadows, and they have one very obvious base, which is the Institute itself. So this map is showing where all Institute-aligned synths can be found within the Commonwealth. What do I mean by Institute-aligned? Simply put, there are synths that hate the Institute and wish to escape, and there are synths who are still completely loyal to the faction. So any groups of synths that aren't loyal to the Institute are not shown here. There are large chunks of the map without any on-the-ground synth presence, particularly the Northeast, most of the downtown Boston area, and a huge swath of the South. I suppose it makes sense that the Institute may avoid having a strong presence where a lot of people live. Even so, there are huge areas that have no hard presence. The star close to the middle is where the Institute itself is located underneath the ruins of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, which is what the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, became before the Great War. The location right next to the star on the map is the actual ruins of CIT that you can stumble upon in the game and explore yourself. It is largely destroyed without much loot, so most people won't spend a lot of time here. The most interesting thing, though, is that there's an active battle between a team of synths and a group of super mutants. I mentioned this in my super mutant cartography video that if you haven't watched, you should definitely check out. A group of first and second generation synths are fighting a group of super mutants. And if we didn't know that the Institute headquarters were lying directly below the ruins, one may wonder why these two groups are fighting in this location. Although the ruins themselves aren't used for much, we are told in-game that the ruins are the primary insertion point for coursers, who are the Institute's elite synths, and it is probably in the best interest of the Institute to keep any faction or group from getting too comfortable in the CIT ruins. So even if the super mutants are able to beat this team of synths, it is likely that more will be sent to keep the ruins from being claimed by any one group. The only location in the Northeast that has a presence at the start of the game in the year of our Adam 2287 is the Makra fish packing plant. This location was a pretty normal and successful business in the pre-war period, but at some point after the Great War it became a base for a group of raiders. Not much is known about this group because before the sole survivor actually steps foot into the facility, there are already grim warning signs. Bodies of raiders are found everywhere, with fresh splatters and puddles of blood, and it isn't clear who has done this until you take the elevator to explore the basement level. Synths, Generation 1s and 2s, are found all throughout the basement level, and if the sole survivor is on good terms with the Institute, then they will be friendly. If the sole survivor is an enemy of the Institute, or has not yet advanced the storyline to where they have discovered and entered the Institute, then the synths will be immediately hostile. There are a lot of synths here, and once you go back up the elevator, more can be found on the upper level that was previously empty. Likewise, leaving the building will reveal that even more synths are standing outside as guards, but why are they here? The synths themselves don't say, and there are no contextual clues. So at the end of the day, we are left with a few options. The Institute may be interested in an area because it has an escaped synth, something that we will see more of a little later, but there is nothing to confirm or negate this assumption at all. They also show interest in some pre-war technology, as we will also see, but this fish factory is bereft of any technology that the Institute would find interesting. That would leave two other reasonable options. Does this place have resources that the Institute would like to recover, or does this location serve some sort of tactical advantage? These last two options are plausible, since this is the only place in the Northeast that has an Institute presence at the beginning of the game, so establishing some kind of base may be beneficial. On the other hand, this location has the most aluminum scrap of any other location, and at least with the Fallout 4 crafting system, aluminum is useful for higher end gear like power armor. Whatever they were after, they sent a very large team, so it must have been pretty important. I would like to hear in the comments what you think the most likely target here was. Moving pretty far west, not too far from where the sole survivor first steps out of Vault 111, is a location that is hidden away, with synths just under the surface. A hidden pre-war facility known as the Switchboard was a defense intelligence agency base that was dedicated to gathering intel on the Chinese, and even developing a system that could predict the future through statistical magic. The base would be one of countless casualties from the Great War, and appears to have been abandoned for a considerable amount of time before it was found by the Railroad, one of the major Fallout 4 factions who are dedicated to freeing synths from their Institute overlords. The Switchboard seems like a dream come true, a hidden and fortified base that was filled to the brim with pre-war intelligence gathering technology and the top secret Predictive Analytical Machine, or PAM for short, which was the classified Event Forecasting Project. PAM was put into a robot body and a Soltron, and this gave her mobility that would prove really useful after the Railroad found her and reprogrammed her to support their cause. It was all too good to be true though, because at an unknown but recent time, the Institute somehow figured out that the Railroad had moved their operations here and sent a large attack force to wipe them out. Many Railroad agents died, but most of the leadership and, importantly, PAM, were able to escape the grasp of the Institute. The Switchboard is only accessible during the Tradecraft mission for the Railroad, and when the sole survivor makes their way into the Switchboard with another Railroad agent, Deacon, a large team of synths are still occupying the facility. A synth leader is trying to hack into a computer that looks like it unlocks a huge vault, and that very vault holds an item that the Railroad wants, only known as the Carrington prototype. Exiting the Switchboard will take you through a Slocum Joe's coffee and donut shop that was used as a front for the secret base, and will reveal several more synths and hostile machine gun turrets surrounded by a bunch of mines, so they really had that place locked down. Should the player clear out the location when aiding the Railroad and recover the Carrington prototype, the synths will disappear from the location permanently. Southwest of the Switchboard is ArcJet Systems, an aerospace and communications technology company who were actively developing several technologies. They were the creators of the Stingray jet, they were working on a new nuclear rocket engine, and also had successfully created what is called a deep-range transmitter as part of a planned attempt by the United States Space Administration to land on Mars in 2078. The deep-range transmitter is actually a very desirable piece of tech, since Dance, the stranded Brotherhood of Steel paladin, needs to recover it in order for him to repair his communications system. Dance and the sole survivor set out to recover the transmitter, and upon entering, they see ominous signs. The facility's pre-war security robots and turrets have been destroyed, and it doesn't take long to see who is responsible. A massive team of synths have been deployed to ArcJet to recover the exact transmitter that Paladin Dance is after. Fighting through the facility, the transmitter is eventually looted from one of the synths near the end of the dungeon, so they were definitely interested in the item, although it is also possible that they were interested in more than that. Why would the Institute want what seems to be a very powerful transmitter of some sort? Well, the Institute is one of the few groups in the whole wasteland that has teleportation technology, and it is possible that some kind of advanced transmitter could help the Institute extend the range of their molecular relay. Or it could be really boring and just let them communicate over larger distances, like perhaps trying to contact some of their members that are far outside of the Commonwealth, like Dr. Zimmer, who is, or at least was, kicking around the capital wasteland far to the south. The synths only show up at ArcJet when doing the Call to Arms quest with Paladin Dance, and the location is never repopulated with synths later in the game. Southwest is the next largest surface base that the Institute operates, and it is an old military base called Fort Hagen. Fort Hagen benefits from an internal security system, a ton of space, and a very defensible position, which all adds up to being a pretty good choice for a base. Most Institute leaders are hesitant to crawl out of their underground hole and set foot on the surface, so we don't find anyone important like that here. Instead, Conrad Kellogg, the Institute's surface asset, as they refer to him, uses this as his base of operations. The old mercenary has a small army of synths working for him and defending the facility, along with the numerous automated defense turrets, terminals, and locked doors. The sole survivor works their way through the fort to confront Kellogg face to face as part of the main quest in a bid to find their long-lost son. All of the defenses, dozens of synths, and even the extremely capable and experienced Merc himself aren't enough to stop the sole survivor, who ends up leaving the facility with a bit more information and a piece of Kellogg's brain. As far as potential locations for Kellogg to claim as a base, this is for sure one of the better ones. It is out of the way, which is good for keeping a low profile, but would make getting around kind of annoying, but is very defensible and probably had a good amount of useful resources. Very close to Fort Hagen is the Boston Mayoral Shelter, which was a personal bunker built for the mayor and his family that was unreasonably lavish for just one family. On the day of the Great War, the mayor and his family were able to make it to the shelter, but an angry mob also formed at the entrance, demanding to be allowed in. The mayor did not see any easy way out of the situation and thought that if he killed himself, that it may lower the temper of the mob enough that when they eventually broke through, they might spare his family. Unfortunately for him and his family, the plan didn't work, and his family was attacked as a horde of angry people broke in, filled with fear and anger. It is unknown what happened with the shelter in the 200 years since, but when the sole survivor decides to explore it themselves, they run into a decently sized team of synths. A very interesting aspect of this location is that the defense turrets that are active will shoot blue laser beams that are only found at the Institute. So it appears that the synths here are not just passing through or even trying to just recover tech. They appear to want to use this as some sort of base. But it's also really close to Fort Hagen, which has a small army of synths, so I don't know why they would want this facility as well, unless they just wanted that sweet basketball court. Oh, and a pet Deathclaw. Here, boy, come here. Come here, boy. The most southern position that the Institute holds is just within the glowing sea, which by looking at the map you can see they otherwise completely avoid. An unassuming shack that is literally labeled Abandoned Shack on the map has an interesting secret. A hatch in the tiny shack is locked, but a quick look into a briefcase that is literally sitting right there will unlock it. It opens up into a hallway, and after throwing a breaker and turning on all or most of the facility's power, will allow a closed door to be opened and all the lights to turn on. A fairly large and most surprisingly, very deep facility is unveiled to the player, and this is the pre-war Federal Surveillance Facility K-21B. There is depressingly little that can be found here actually, and the few government employees who were here when the bombs dropped died shortly after because the facility was not adequately stocked with rations. The place seems completely empty until the sole survivor reaches the bottom floor where only a few synths can be found. The low number probably means that it is not any sort of base for the Institute, but I find it really weird that the switch that the sole survivor has to throw in order to open the door also turns on most of the facility's lights. Were those synths just kicking around in the dark down there? Were they stuck in here because the switch somehow deactivated and the door got locked? At any rate, I think it is most likely that they were interested in the tech that could be found there, as there is a unique item that looks exactly like a radio but is labeled as surveillance device, and when turned on, it only plays static. Far to the east on the coast of Boston is the most southeasterly of all Institute holdings, a place known as University Point, or was known because like many of these places that the Institute occupies, they had to do a whole lot of killing to get it. University Point was once a bustling settlement that was popular with traders and merchants. A young whiz kid named Jacqueline was exploring the old University of Massachusetts that the settlers had built their community on and around. She came across pre-war research into nuclear reactor efficiency that had the details to a major breakthrough and tried to sell it to some passing merchants. At least one of these traders was an Institute informant, and when the Institute caught wind of potentially groundbreaking research into nuclear power, they acted swiftly. The Institute was trying to gain complete power independence, creating a reactor that could satisfy their electrical needs for decades to come, so they were understandably interested. What was less understandable, however, were their heavy-handed tactics, sending their favorite operator, Conrad Kellogg, and a whole group of synths to demand that Jacqueline, and by extension, the community, hand over the research. This confrontation led to bloodshed, and the synths wiped out the entire community, causing this once bustling town to be a shell of its former self. Several synths still walk the grounds, although their purpose isn't immediately clear. Perhaps they think that more useful pre-war research could be found amongst the ruins. And so we come to the last location, and the only one in downtown Boston that the Institute holds. And, well, to be honest, I went back and forth about including this one on the map, but it's just too odd to leave out. An unmarked, small, and easily missed location called the Warren Theater is truly forgettable in all respects but one. With not much area to explore, barely any loot, and no pre-war messages or relics that tell an interesting story, what could possibly be notable about this location? Well, there is a small theater stage that is impossible to miss due to how small the area is, and on the stage are a number of mannequins standing before a very lively crowd. Mannequins are disturbingly common in Boston, and that topic deserves its own video, but back behind the mannequins is an unmoving and otherwise unassuming Generation 2 synth. The synth will wait until you are only feet away before it will activate and potentially attack the player, and this can be a pretty good jump scare if you aren't paying attention. That's it though. One hibernating synth on a stage with a bunch of mannequins in an otherwise forgotten theater in Boston's downtown. Did this synth get confused? It isn't rogue, since if the sole survivor is on good terms with the Institute, it won't attack. Did the synth imprint on the mannequins like a duckling to its mom? I have a hard time believing the synth is here on actual Institute business, but truth be told, it wouldn't be the first questionable action by the Institute. Here's an overlay of the creature leveling map in Fallout 4, which I am showing here because I have in previous videos, but I think it's less relevant than before. There doesn't seem to be much of a correlation between where we see the Institute and the difficulty of the area, although there are definitely fewer locations in the hardest parts of the map which are shown in red. The biggest influence on where we find the Institute seems to be where wastelanders live, with a high population in Boston proper, and fewer people living on the fringes of the map. This makes sense on the one hand because the Institute is trying to stay in the shadows and stay as mysterious and unpredictable as possible. On the other hand, they are active in gathering intelligence, and it would make sense to be close to the population centers if you are trying to gather data and intelligence. The Institute has an ace up their sleeve in the intelligence gathering efforts though, and I want to show that in one of the more interesting maps just a little later in this video. Another map I like doing is showing the population distribution of the Institute locations, and I do this by going through each location and counting how many Institute members and synths I can find. Exact numbers will change game to game, so I round any number over 5 to the nearest 5, with a plus denoting my personal observations being an extra 1 or 2 individuals. Surprise, surprise, the Institute itself is where we see the most members, but some of these other areas raise some eyebrows. ArcJet Systems has the next highest number of synths, and goes to show that the Institute was willing to commit an impressive number of assets to the mission of recovering the deep range transmitter. They really wanted that thing. The switchboard also had a lot, with synths occupying the recently taken railroad headquarters, likely because they are still trying to recover everything they can from the railroad. The synth leader is still trying to break into the vault, and it just makes sense that the Institute would have a large force here. Fort Hagen has a bunch of synths, which makes sense since it's Kellogg's base, And all of this adds up to quite a concentrated number of synths in this portion of the map. Honestly, I find the areas with very few synths more interesting than the ones with a lot, like the Federal Surveillance Center, which only has 3 synths chilling in the dark, and then the 1 synth in Boston doing his best impression of a mannequin. The next map shows locations that the Institute will attack and sometimes occupy during the course of the game, shown in blue. Just some general observations here. These attacks fill some holes left in the last map, like around Boston and a bit in the northeast, which makes sense given the number of population centers around here. There is still a massive hole in the southern part of the map, but that's not for a lack of interesting locations. Locations with potential resources, tech, or information, like Vault 81, Vault 95, and the Coast Guard Pier are just to name a few, along with logistically interesting locations like the Gunner's headquarters. All can be found in this area. Let's look at these locations that the Institute attacks during the game, why the Institute is interested in them, and we're going to start in the south this time. The Poseidon Energy Plant in the southeast was a pre-war natural gas and solar power plant that since the pre-war became infested with mirelurks on the lower levels. At some point, a group of raiders led by someone named Cuddy set up shop at the plant, but not even they are able to completely clear the mirelurks of those lower levels. At some point, a team of synths led by a courser will infiltrate the power plant and begin systematically wiping out the raiders, eventually claiming the power plant for themselves. While coursers seem mainly focused on retrieving escaped or mind-wiped synths for reclamation, they will also lead teams of synths into special operations and attacks, so this doesn't necessarily mean that they're there to reclaim a synth. The location does not have much loot, nor is it a particularly great location for a fortified base like Fort Hagen or the Boston Mayoral Shelter. However, companions are scripted to say unique dialogue at some locations, and this is one of them. While I looked at all companion comments, I had a particular interest in the comments from X688, who was the one possible companion that is an Institute courser, since if anyone can give us a glimpse into what the Institute might think about a given place, it would probably be from him. X688 comments near some generators, saying it's unusual to find this much machinery intact. The scavengers typically tear these things to pieces. Could this be the reason why the Institute decided to take the location? Certainly seems plausible if the salvage is unusually well preserved. Around the Boston area are several locations that are attacked by the Institute as part of the main quest storylines, as the Institute aims to secure their power requirements and deal blows against rival factions on the surface. One of the largest buildings in downtown Boston is the Mass Fusion Building, the headquarters of the premier fusion power company in the Commonwealth. Now, fusion is in quotes because they weren't actually using fusion, rather dirty old fission reactors in order to generate power. They were on the verge of a breakthrough when the Great War upended everything, and one of the key components was something called the beryllium agitator. The agitator is needed by the Institute to get their own nuclear reactor going, and well into the main quest, when siding with the Institute, they orchestrate an operation to get the agitator. Before this mission, the building is filled with gunners, likely there to get scrap or technology for themselves or a client. But when the sole survivor enters mass fusion with the Institute, the Brotherhood of Steel is there to put a stop to everything. The Brotherhood and the Institute are diametrically opposed. The Brotherhood looking to control and regulate all technology, and the Institute who relentlessly pushes technology to ethically questionable levels. The Institute will manage to thwart the Brotherhood, fighting through multiple levels of this towering skyscraper, eventually claiming their prize. The facility will stand empty after this epic battle, but it wouldn't be surprising if a team of synths continue to scour the building for more technology or research. To the north of Mass Fusion is Bunker Hill, the biggest trading hub within the Commonwealth. Since merchants and caravans are constantly coming and going, it became an important community for the railroad to infiltrate to try and use the bustle of commerce to help get escaping synths out of the Commonwealth. The Institute got word of a number of escaped synths being hidden at Bunker Hill while the railroad is in the process of trying to help them quietly get out of the Commonwealth. and the Institute sends the sole survivor with another courser and a team of supporting synths to recover the runaways. Somehow, the Brotherhood catches wind of the Institute plans, and this is the only time in-game that we get to see 3 of the main factions at the same location, all fighting each other. Although the ultimate fate of the 4 runaways is left up to the sole survivor, if siding with the Institute, their recall codes will be said, putting them into a shutdown state so that they can be easily reclaimed and teleported back to the Institute. The Institute, with the sole survivor, some coursers, and a team of synths, can beat back the Brotherhood attack, kill a large number of railroad operatives, and reclaim 4 synths, potentially being a very decisive victory. But the Institute does not stay here or claim any sort of control over the settlement itself. To the west is a large building that is mostly inaccessible for the entirety of the game because it is actually a railroad safe house called Ticonderoga. The location will become unlocked after the railroad quest Boston After Dark, and the sole survivor helps transport a runaway synth here. Later in the game, the railroad leader, Desdemona, will task the sole survivor with making contact with the Ticonderoga safe house and check on their status, as they appear to have gone dark. Entering the building and going up the elevator will make it clear that something isn't right. Maybe it's the silence. Maybe it's the dead railroad agents. Maybe it's the freaking courser and his group of synths that immediately start interrogating you. The courser can be convinced through 2 speech checks that you are from the Synth Retention Bureau from the Institute, which is the wing that is focused on the recovery of runaway synths. However, the defensive turrets they set up will always engage the sole survivor, and once that happens, then the group of synths will turn hostile. Even after dealing with the synth team on the inside, another group led by a courser will be encountered outside of the safe house, who will also need to be fought. But even with both synth groups being wiped out, the end result is the same. The Institute successfully wiped out the entire safe house, and the railroad is no longer able to use this location. The Institute takes what intelligence they can and doesn't return to this location later in the game. South and west a bit, we run into a very large building called Green Tech Genetics. This building was actually a part of CIT in the pre-war days, focused on genetic research and other undisclosed research projects. We don't know much about its post-war history, other than it became the focus of a gunner salvage project where a massive number of gunners were picking this building apart. They had come across a lone woman and decided the chivalrous thing to do would be to help her, give her some food and a handful of caps. No, the gunners are total assholes and they took her prisoner and locked her up. Jenny, as she prefers to be called, is on the run from the Institute because she is an escaped synth, and it is here in this building at the top floor where she was kept locked up that a courser who had been dispatched to find her set his sights on this location. The courser started to cut his way through the gunners, killing his way to the top, and whatever poor saps he passed by were then cleaned up by the sole survivor, who was hot on the courser's tail. The sole survivor wants a courser chip, which is a component that allows coursers to interface with the Institute teleporter. The courser wants the runaway synth, and Jenny just wants to GTFO, and all of this culminates in the top floor, where the sole survivor confronts the courser and kills him, taking their chip. Jenny's fate is left to the player, as she can't get out of the locked room by herself, and no matter what course of action is taken, she is never heard from again. So the Institute's interest in this location is solely based on one runaway synth that a courser has tracked to this location, and otherwise, the location goes uninhabited, now a tomb of dozens of gunners. Just west of Green Tech is Kendall Hospital that has a wild post-war history. At some point, it was adopted as a railroad safe house called Augusta Safe House. It is unknown how long the railroad used this location, but we can probably assume it wasn't for long because the railroad just can't stay in any one place for very long. Around the time the switchboard was invaded, the Augusta Safe House was also attacked, and the synths completely wiped out all the railroad agents. What is kind of crazy though is that after the synths had killed everyone at this location, a group of raiders happened upon the hospital, and they seemed to have attacked the synths and killed all of them. There are synth remains scattered about, and the railroad bodies have been burned in an indoor bonfire, and also thrown down to the bottom floor where their pet Deathclaw lives. What is kind of crazy though is that after all the synths had killed everyone at this location, a group of raiders happened upon the hospital, where they possibly attacked the synths and killed all of them because there are synth remains that we can see left behind, or possibly those synths were casualties from their fight with the railroad and they just walked into a building full of dead people. The synth remains are scattered about, and the railroad bodies have been burned in an indoor bonfire, and also thrown down to the bottom floor where their pet Deathclaw lives. The player can happen upon the location, or they're sent by Desdemona, the leader of the railroad, after they had not heard from them in a while. In either scenario where the synths are killed by the raiders or they left by themselves, this location would otherwise have no interest for the Institute, as it doesn't have any tech, resources, or tactical advantage that they would be interested in. Northwest of the hospital are the Grey Garden hydroponic farms that are tended to by a group of Mr. Handies. Not far from the gardens is a house known as the Grey Garden Homestead that is unremarkable 9 times out of 10 because it has just some minor loot and nothing else other than one locked door. Fast forward, after the sole survivor has helped the Institute through several main quests, they will be sent back to the homestead because an Institute operation has gone awry. See, the homestead is actually the home of an independent Commonwealth scientist named T.S. Wallace, and his scientific proclivities caught the eye of the Institute. They decide to show up, and due to their awesome reputation amongst the Commonwealth, thought they could just ask Wallace to join them and he'd be totally down. Predictably, Wallace freaked out and he locked himself in the bathroom, refusing to come out. It is then up to the sole survivor to defuse the situation, since Wallace calls upon either the Minutemen or gunners to protect his home, since he is convinced the Institute is acting maliciously. The Institute genuinely wants to use his skills for their own scientific endeavors, and he can be convinced to stand down and go with the extraction team through a series of dialogue options. The homestead is then left completely empty, and we can find Wallace working in the Advanced Systems Division in the Institute later on. One of the few locations up north that gained the interest of the Institute is Malden Center, a large area of metro tunnels and stations that have been claimed by a raider group led by their leader, Helter Skelter. The sole survivor can just happen upon the location by chance, and they will find 2 synths guarding the entrance of the subway station with some dead raiders strewn about. Going into the station, more raider bodies and a number of synths can be found until the very end of the dungeon, where an absolute battle is raging. The synths have cornered the raiders, who are now fighting for their lives as the synths look to completely exterminate the raiders. The fact that all the raiders are killed makes me think that they're not there for a hidden runaway synth, and these old subway tunnels and stations wouldn't really have all that much interesting intelligence or tech, would they? Well, one clue could come from a Brotherhood of Steel raiding quest called Quarter Mastery, where Scribe Halen sends the sole survivor to different locations to locate and recover different kinds of technology. Halen will send the player to Malden Center to recover technology, so it's possible that the Institute is there for a similar reason. The location is also smack dab between super mutants, gunners, and ghouls, and so in my estimation would be a very poor choice for any sort of base. Libertalia on the east coast is a unique location because it is built out at sea on a number of floating platforms and boats. It is run by a group of raiders who have a leader named Gabriel, who is apparently a pretty gnarly dude. The Institute normally wouldn't care about such menial surface things, but Gabriel is actually an escaped synth who had his mind wiped and doesn't remember his past Institute life. One of the first missions the sole survivor can do for the Institute is to go along with a courser to retrieve Gabriel so that he can be reintegrated back with the Institute. And so, Libertalia is attacked by the sole survivor and one courser. All the raiders die, but they will repopulate this location later in the game, since it's just too good of a place to leave abandoned for long. Now we come to the last location that the Institute will attack after the beginning of Fallout 4, and that is the Sandy Cove's convalescent home, and I saved the best for last. This pre-war nursing home had their hands full with elderly folks who were in their care, dealing with escapees on the regular. In an attempt to keep some of the folks from getting away, they installed a fake bus stop across the street in the hopes that any escapees would stand there and wait for a bus that would never come, allowing the nursing home staff to find them and bring them back in. The building itself is memorable because of the different decorations each room had, as their residents were allowed to decorate their rooms, including one that had taxidermied, mutated creatures that shouldn't have been around before the Great War. One old woman, Gladys, was a retired soldier who even had a stash of grenades and other munitions squirreled away in her room, so there definitely were some characters. Several Mr. Handys worked at the nursing home and are still, all these years later, doing their jobs, but there are some other, more furry residents. A number of cats call this place home, and perhaps they are descended from the cats that were pets of one particular resident, and they still like to hang around here almost 2 centuries later. So what about this location could account for the fact that, after exploring the location and heading back towards the front door, a team of synths will bust in and start going crazy. They kill the entire Mr. Handy staff, and most horrifically, they go on an extermination campaign against all the cats, wiping them all out. I am not sure what the Institute would be after here. There is no technology, no intelligence, and all that can be found behind the security gate and wall of safes is a syringer and a number of chems, hardly worth dispatching an entire synth team for. Without any obvious reasons, we're only left to assume that the Institute hates cats, and this was just one massacre in their holy war against those of the feline persuasion. If you don't hate the Institute after that, then you probably never will. Now on to my favorite map of this video, in large part because it covers something that is somewhat unique to the Institute. In order for the Institute to operate beneath the surface and separate from everybody else, they need to have a good intelligence gathering apparatus. And they have the best one in the entire Commonwealth. I have divided their intelligence assets into 3 groups. The first one being static informants. These are people that stay more or less in one location and pass information along to the Institute. From the map you can see that there are only 4 locations, but 2 of these have more than one informant. Let's look at Diamond City first. It is really no shock to know that the Institute has infiltrated Diamond City, and they have 2 known assets, and that is not including Kellogg, who technically does have a house in Diamond City, but his job isn't to stay in Diamond City and gather information, so he's not being counted here. The first and most obvious of the informants is none other than the mayor of Diamond City, Mayor McDonough. McDonough is a very interesting character because he is the brother of the possible ghoul companion, John Hancock, the most chill and unchill dude in the Commonwealth. McDonough was a pretty normal older brother for Hancock for most of their lives, until one day McDonough became fixated on running for mayor of Diamond City. He ran on a very divisive platform. His main promise was to kick out all the ghoul residents of the city. He was able to whip up anti-ghoul sentiment to levels not seen before, and this jettisoned his campaign above all others, easily winning the majority of votes in the next election. True to his word, he forced all the ghouls to leave, which led to immense suffering and in many instances death for the ghouls that were kicked out. This ended the relationship between McDonough and Hancock because Hancock could not forgive his brother for his cruelty. The thing is, McDonough is not really Hancock's brother, because at some point before the run to be mayor, he was replaced with a synth. Mayor McDonough is a synth. His entire campaign was specially crafted to get him into power, and all of this was an Institute plan that was executed to perfection. McDonough would meet with Kellogg when the need arose, and would receive and send along information to the Institute, who were basically the city's shadow leaders. It is interesting to note that the companion Piper has done some snooping around and come to the conclusion herself that McDonough is a synth, which has made the mayor take measures to keep Piper out of the city, which is how the sole survivor first meets both Piper and the mayor. Some logs in the Institute show that the Institute leaders feel like they're not getting a whole lot from the mayor and are in active talks to end the operation and retire McDonough. By retirement, we mean they'll kill him. mostly because his synth body had to be specially made to be fatter than normal, and the Institute apparently can't be cheesed to find another use for him. The other informant that can be found in Diamond City is not a synth, but the owner of the upscale bar in Diamond City, and his name is Henry Cook. Cook is a shady bloke for sure, and it isn't all that surprising to find out that he is feeding information to the Institute. When he isn't doing that, he is working with some Diamond City folks to smuggle chems into the city, is having an affair with someone's wife, and keeping secret the fact that he was able to buy this bar because he ripped off his current chem supplier many years ago. While it isn't stated for certain, it is likely that Cook is being compensated monetarily because that's all he seems to care about due to his messed up moral compass. Having an informant in a bar seems like a pretty good idea since it attracts many people who are often talking and swapping stories. But it seems like the Dugout Inn would be a better place for an informant because it has a lot more people. Good Neighbor is another large location where all misfits and drifters who wouldn't fit in with Diamond City folk go to scrape by. There are two informants here as well, AJ and Morosky. AJ is a small-time drug dealer that hangs out in Good Neighbor and has the lowest prices on chems. Due to this, he sells Jet and Psycho to the Bunker Hill leader Kessler, who in turn is using the chems to pay off raiders to leave the trading caravans alone. AJ is also notable for a recent campaign to try and sell chems to kids with his incredibly creative name, Chems for Kids. It is unknown how successful this is, but it has gotten enough attention that when the sole survivor dons the costume of the Silver Shroud comic book character, AJ is one of the targets of the Shroud. We don't know any more about his connection as an informant to the Institute, but again, it is most likely he's doing it for the money. While AJ may have been a small fish, Morosky is not, being one of the biggest chem suppliers in the Commonwealth. He has his own chem lab at the Four Leaf Fish Packing Plant and sells some of his supply to Henry Cook and other dealers in Good Neighbor. Morosky does not put up with any BS, seems to be affiliated with the Triggermen criminal group, and has done well enough for himself that he owns the Hotel Rexford in Good Neighbor, and again is likely earning a bit of money on the side, passing information along to the Institute. He is a good person to have as an informant though, due to his high number of connections, as well as owning a hotel that is constantly seeing a number of different people as they pass through. Not too far from Good Neighbor in Diamond City is another informant, Tommy Lonergan. Tommy is the owner and manager of the Combat Zone, which pits his sole employee and possible companion to the player, Kate, against raiders. While it seems at one point he had a pretty diverse crowd of people that would come to watch the fights, he recently made a deal with some local raiders to cater only to them, driving off all other clientele. It should come as no surprise that someone who forces a hopelessly addicted chem addict to fight other raiders is also the kind of guy that would pass information along to the Institute. The last of the static informants that we know of is Roger Warwick, a synth who has replaced the actual Roger some time ago. Roger is the leader of his decent-sized settlement who gets by on growing a variety of crops. The real Roger was an unkind man to both his wife and his children, who was also quite lazy, something that the synth version doesn't emulate, and the synth also lacks the drunken tirades, which has made many people suspicious. His foreman, named Bill, has gone as far as requesting a hitman to come and kill Roger, allowing Bill to take control of the farm, because he is utterly convinced that the real Roger has been replaced with a synth spy. And he's right. The Institute's intent with the Warwick homestead is to have them unknowingly plant genetically modified seeds to see how they grow and interact with conditions on the surface. Once the Institute is satisfied with the experiment, they plan to extract Roger and destroy all evidence of the experiment, most likely meaning the slaughter of everyone there, because the Institute are heartless monsters. So those are the static informants that stay only at one location, and if this was all the Institute had in terms of informants, it would be pretty weak. Yeah, Diamond City and Good Neighbor are good places to have informants, but the Commonwealth is a big place. This is where we get the roving informants, 4 different traveling merchants who are all informants for the Institute. Each of the merchants have a set number of locations that they visit, although their exact routes are not set in stone. Here are all the routes overlaid by one another. and since the merchants don't have an exact route, the paths are fuzzy in order to give the idea of what the overall route kind of is. So looking at the merchants individually, let's start with the diva herself, Trash Can Carla. It might come as a bummer to some of you, but the royal tactfulness herself has an institute side hustle, and her normal route is usually quite simple. She will travel from the Drumlin Diner in Sanctuary Hills most of the time, which is a small route. But like all the merchants, she will sometimes be seen at Bunker Hill, at which point she will go on an epic journey to get back to her normal route. She goes northeast, hooks up to the Greentop Nursery settlement, travels through Malden, which is filled to the brim with gunners, super mutants, ghouls, and synths, so she gets points for bravery, I guess, then continues past Covenant, the Starlight Drive-In, and finally arrives at the Drumlin Diner to resume her normal route. Lucas Miller is another traveling merchant specializing in armor and clothing, and he also has a pretty simple loop. He will travel between Greentop Nursery to 10 Pines Bluff, drop down to Covenant, and then back to Greentop Nursery by going through the incredibly dangerous Malden area. He can be found in Bunker Hill and takes the same route as Trash Can Carla to get out, going northeast across the bridge and then straight up to Greentop Nursery. Doc Weathers is a traveling doctor and chem supplier, but one of those classy ones, not like AJ at Good Neighbor. He also has a main route that he can often be found at, starting at County Crossing, and then going north to Finch Farm and eventually the Slog. However, sometimes he will also travel northeast to a small unmarked camp close to the Museum of Witchcraft, as well as traveling south by Long Neck Lukowski's Cannery and Lynn Pier Parking, so this route can look like a loop. When he is leaving Bunker Hill, he goes up the same route as everyone else, leaving northeast and then starting his normal route at County Crossing. The last merchant is that wild lady herself, Cricket. She sells weapons, including the fan favorite spray and pray explosive submachine gun, all the while looking like she's on a 3-day jet bender. But hey, maybe I'd look the same if I had to travel the routes that she does, because not only does she have the most possible routes, but they are the longest and go through the most hostile territories as well. Cricket's main route takes her from the Warwick Homestead, past the North Star Wreck and Poseidon Energy Plant, past Quincy and Quincy Quarries, up past Fairline Hill Estates, the Boston Police Rationing Site, Diamond City, and ending at Vault 81. An alternate route will have her travel past the Suffolk County Charter School, past Gunners Plaza, then up north past Fallon's Department Store, and onward to Vault 81. Both of these routes are incredibly dangerous. She goes by a ton of raiders, gunners, super mutants, and Yao Guai on just a normal Tuesday. Cricket will also leave from Bunker Hill and takes a very roundabout way to get back to her route. She will travel on the north side of the river, up to College Square, then back down to the river, while she will cross and make her way past Hangman's Alley and go to Vault 81. This gives her the longest and most complicated of all merchant routes, but once you look at all possible locations that these merchants can stop at or pass through, all the while talking with people, hearing rumors, and seeing things for themselves, you start to get an idea of how useful they can be to the Institute. With these traveling informants, we get great coverage in the Northeast and in the area south of Boston, but almost the entire western portion lacks any informants, although they do have a number of actual bases loaded to the gills with synths, so perhaps that offsets the lack of informants. One note here is that we know that University Point, which was sacked by the Institute to recover the pre-war nuclear reactor research, only became known to the Institute because of a traitor that Jacqueline tried to sell the research to. Obviously, there are plenty of traitors that we don't meet or see that are implied to exist. There aren't just 4 merchants for the entirety of the Commonwealth, but there is a chance that the traitor that passed along info to the Institute and would be partially responsible for the settlement's demise is Cricket, since University Point is not far off her path. It is conceivable that it was a stopping point for her back in the day, since she goes right by it on a regular basis. Cricket, tell me, what have you done? These eyes have seen things. There is one more trick up the Institute's sleeve though, and that is their Watcher initiative. Watcher is the name the Institute has given to synth crows that are specifically created to watch and surveil a number of places on the surface, and we can see what appears to be their live feeds in the Institute itself. Crows are seen all over the Commonwealth, and their distribution is largely random, and that makes it impractical to try and map out. There are a number of locations though where crows are always seen, and those are marked in red with a yellow outline. Vault 111 will always have a murder of crows hanging out where the platform rises up, no doubt put there by Father himself, since he was also the one to give the go-ahead to have the sole survivor thawed out. To the south, crows are found at the Lonely Chapel, a pretty quiet location that doesn't have much to it, except that it has a secret passage to the Raider-controlled federal ration stockpile. Along the highway close by are several gunner camps, so perhaps the Institute is interested in either of these groups. Out west, we see crows at the Wildwood Cemetery, which is really only occupied by ghouls, although entering one of the mausoleums will cause a raider ambush as well. I don't know what the Institute hopes to learn from this location, unless they're just interested in observing ghoul behavior. To the south, the Institute has several crows hanging around the odd little town of Covenant, and this place actually makes sense. Covenant is one half of a project that is dedicated to research into identifying synths and locking them away. It is not a big surprise then that the Institute is interested in monitoring this community, although it's not clear if the Institute is actually aware of the secret compound where the bulk of the anti-synth research goes on, and where they lock away these suspected synths. Unsurprisingly, crows are all over Diamond City, meaning that it is covered by informants, a passing merchant in the form of Cricket, Kellogg sometimes, in addition to the Watchers. It would seem not much goes on in the Commonwealth's most populous city that the Institute wouldn't know about. The last location is interesting because it is specifically said by Alana Seckert, an Institute scientist working at the Synth Retention Bureau, that they have deployed Watchers to the castle, likely to monitor the progress that the Minutemen can make in reestablishing themselves in the Commonwealth. The thing is, although they say there are Watchers there, I could not consistently find them at or close by the castle. So yeah, someone's not doing their job, Elena. I do find it interesting that there are no crows to be seen hanging around in Goodneighbor though, since it is one of the most populous settlements in the Commonwealth, with a lot of people drifting in and out. The railroad will give the sole survivor a radiant quest called Variable Removal, which follows the same basic formula. There are a set number of locations where a courser can be observed to be, and the sole survivor is sent to take that courser out. Here are the locations that the coursers can be found at, and most of them align with locations where the Institute already has a presence, like University Point or ArcJet Systems. Other locations are ones we see them attack in-game, places like Poseidon Energy or Sandy Convalescent Homes, aka the Kitty Graveyard. There are a couple other locations though that aren't occupied by the Institute, nor do we see them try and attack. One location is the General Atomics Factory, a place where Mr. Handies and Miss Nannies are assembled and tested. It seems most likely that they are interested in some of the tech in this area, as the Mechanist also shows a lot of interest in this area due to all the robotics. But that is the most notable thing about this location. Another location that is technology and robotics heavy is the Watts Consumer Electronics Store, where coursers can be found as well. The only thing this place has over the General Atomics Factory is that it has more copper here than any other location, and that might interest the Institute, who is constantly expanding and needing resources. The last location that coursers can be found at is Reeb Marina, which is the most puzzling of all the locations. It has no tech, no resources, no people. It has a few Mr. Handies who are programmed to ambush one of the previous residents who called this place home. Let me know if you guys have an idea as to why the Institute would be interested enough in this place to send their most highly trained units. And so we come to the last few maps that show the places that the Institute attacks in order to wipe out the two factions that they are actively fighting throughout the game. The Railroad had their headquarters at the Switchboard, and the Augustus Safe House raided by the Institute not long after the sole survivor emerged from Vault 111. Later, they lose both Ticonderoga as well as a number of agents and escaping synths at the Battle for Bunker Hill, and eventually, the Institute locates their headquarters underneath the Old North Church and orders the sole survivor to destroy the Railroad HQ and all the leaders along with it, dealing the final blow to the organization in the Commonwealth. The Brotherhood is an interesting case because even though the Institute is at war with them, there aren't really many battles between the two. The Brotherhood does show up at the Battle for Bunker Hill, where they can be beat back, but they aren't the reason why the Institute is there. The Institute can defeat the Brotherhood at the Mass Fusion building while they are trying to recover the beryllium agitator, and if successful, then the Brotherhood sustains considerable casualties. That's really it, not counting Dance's fight at ArcJet, and it isn't until the Institute executes their plan to destroy the Brotherhood airship and ground base at the Boston airport that the Brotherhood can be considered defeated. Should the Institute be victorious, this is what their holdings will look like, with the blue stars representing military checkpoints where the Institute has since stationed around the Commonwealth to project their power and keep any other group from growing to the point where they can be a threat to the Institute. In the event of an Institute defeat, which I personally think will be the canon ending for Fallout 4, they lose some but not all of the places that they held during the game. The Institute itself and the CIT ruins are now just a giant watery crater since the sole survivor detonated their nuclear reactor in a fantastic explosion. And through the course of the main quest, certain locations are cleared out, like Fort Hagen, and they are not repopulated. However, locations like the Boston Mayoral Shelter, the Federal Surveillance Center, University Point, and the Macrofish Packing Plant are all still inhabited by synths. Perhaps the synths stationed here just remained even after the destruction of the Institute, no longer having someone with authority to give them new directives. If that is the case, then these synths are likely to remain in these locations until they are discovered and killed by whatever faction rules the Commonwealth, or maybe raiders, scavengers, or other settlers who accidentally stumble upon them. What is interesting though is that the locations that come under attack by the Institute will still be attacked after the main quest and the Institute has been destroyed. The Sandy Coves Convalescent Home, Malden Center Subway, ArcJet, and the Poseidon Energy Plant will all still come under attack after the Institute has been destroyed. And perhaps we can apply the same logic here. It is possible that some of these attack teams are just still executing whatever protocols they had before the Institute was destroyed. And in the absence of any other directive, they simply carry out their commands until they die or they're successful. However, the only remnants from the Institute are a group of refugees that survived the destruction of the Institute and will ask the sole survivor for help in establishing a new community at a settlement location. The future of the Institute looks to be a slow attrition of the remaining synths in these different locations as they are destroyed or powered down or fall apart over time, and the Institute refugees will likely just become another community within the Commonwealth, looking to put their past behind them and just survive like everyone else. And that there, my wonderful glowing friends, are all the maps related to the Institute in Fallout 4. I hope you have enjoyed this look at a very interesting faction within the Fallout universe and learned a thing or two. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of my conclusions or things that I may have missed. Huge thanks to my awesome patrons who go the extra mile in supporting me, and welcome to my newest patron, Hipster Jesus. If you like what I do, you can support me however you see fit. And if you would like to become a patron, links are in the description. Adam bless and guide you all. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you soon.